Hello, everyone. Hi. Oh, that was a nice response back. I like that. So welcome to tonight's lecture, Bless Her Heart, How One Good Southern Girl Changed the World, sponsored by the Margaret Cunningham Women's Center. I'm Katie Garcia, and I'm a program coordinator over at the Women's Center. And we are so excited to be spending the evening with Shelby Knox and with you all tonight. Before I do get started, I have a few folks to thank this evening. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our home departments, the Office of the Provost, and the Office of the Dean of Students for their continued support for the work that we do here at the Women's Center on our campus. I'd also like to thank the fantastic people that I work with, who I not only get to call colleagues, but also friends and fellow change agents. So thank you, Nora, Casey, Katie, Terry, Natalie, and our fantastic undergraduate interns, Kendall and Jennifer. I'm so grateful for you all. We do have a few housekeeping rules, so if you could all just take a second to put your cell phones on silent, I'd really appreciate that. After Shelby has done her talk, we will have a brief time for Q&A, so we just ask that you save your questions for the end. And then lastly, all of you have a survey on your chair, so if you could please take the time at the end to fill that out and leave it behind in your chair. We'll be back to pick it up when it's over. So now I'm excited to have the opportunity to introduce Shelby. Shelby Knox is nationally known as the subject of the Sundance award-winning film, The Education of Shelby Knox, a 2005 documentary chronicling her teenage activism for comprehensive sex education and gay rights in her Southern Baptist community. Shelby started off as a textbook conservative girl, pro-life, committed to celibacy, and opera-singing straight-A student. But Shelby, then 15 years old, ended up surprising everyone as she grew into a passionate advocate for the fight for medically based, comprehensive sexuality education in Lubbock, Texas. Outraged by Lubbock County's sky-high rates of sexually transmitted infections and unplanned pregnancies, Shelby disagreed with her legislature's decision to exclusively offer abstinence-only education to herself and her classmates, and she took action. Shelby has appeared on The Today Show, The Daily Show, Hardball, and sat down with Dr. Phil and Al Franken to discuss sexual education and youth activism. She travels across country as an organizer, doing trainings, workshops, and civil disobedience in the name of reproductive justice and sexual health. She currently consults for the Girl Leadership Institute, Plan B, and Trojan, among many other things. Shelby's Southern upbringing and commitment to social justice and women's empowerment made her an easy choice for the Women's Center's fall speaker. But it's not just that we were interested in hearing more about her work. It's also that as a young person, she saw something she wanted to change, and she took action to change it. We see the same moxie in you, Vanderbilt students. You see things every day that irk you, scare you, make you mad, and you, like Shelby, take steps to make the world better. You call it action or activism, service, whatever words you use and whatever issues you champion, you aim to make the world better. Mahatma Gandhi encouraged us to be the change you want to see in the world. And we hope that tonight you leave inspired to do just that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shelby Knox.
Hi. Oh, good. I'm going to get to sit here and see myself every couple of minutes. And that scary picture in which I'm 17 and, oh, you can't hear me, in which I'm 17 and look really pissed, but I think I was just being really overly dramatic. So it's so wonderful to see you all tonight. Thank you all so much for coming out. I know for some of you this is a requirement. I'm sorry. I'll try not to be boring. You can talk crap about me on the internet later if you want. Or during. I've had people tweet shit about me while I'm speaking. So as Katie was saying, I am a Southern girl. I grew up in Lubbock, Texas. Has anyone ever been to Lubbock, Texas? Okay, seriously? Why? There are two people. Why did you go to Lubbock, Texas? You don't just happen to be in Lubbock, Texas. What? Yes. So Texas Tech University is probably one of the reasons you would know about it. We picked up Bobby Knight a couple years ago. Like, no one would want him, except we totally did. We also are the home of Buddy Holly. Y'all know who he is? The Dixie Chicks. We are known for, let's see, we arrested the Chippendales. Lubbock arrested the Chippendales because they were being sexually provocative in public. It was kind of awesome because they were like an all-male police force like on the sides of the club. And they didn't really have a definition. It's sort of like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. I'll know it when I see it. So I don't know exactly which pelvic thrust made them arrest the Chippendales, but that happened. Let's see, it used to be illegal to sell vibrators in Texas until a couple years ago. That had to go to the Supreme Court. I'm dead serious. Because for it to be legal, and having more than 6 was intent to distribute. So I was totally living illegally in college, but they actually did a sting operation of a lingerie store that was selling vibrators, and they had 10, so they were intending to distribute them. Yes, so this is where I grew up. It is the second most conservative city in the nation. Does anyone know what the first would be? Salt Lake is really close. It's Provo, Utah. Yes, so it makes sense. I always say about Lubbock that the city council members probably had a meeting after these rankings came out to figure out why they had lost. They are that crazy. There's also a song called Happiness is Lubbock, Texas in my rearview mirror, which is definitely, I play a lot and think about a lot. But this was where I was born and raised, and I was raised Southern Baptist in the church. I know Tennessee is a religious community as well, so you know what it means when I say that we were in church every time the doors were open. On Wednesday night and Thursday for mission, and then Sunday in the morning and at night, because you got to come back at night and you need a lot of God. So I was raised Southern Baptist, and my parents are strong Republicans. They voted for George Bush before he unleashed himself on the whole nation. He was the governor of Texas. This was sort of, as Katie was saying, who I was. I was a good Southern Baptist girl. And so it was in this environment when I was 15 years old that I took something called the True Love Waits Pledge. I bet y'all have that here. Has anyone heard of that? So basically, it's a program that happened at church, and it happens in Sunday school. And it was like a 10-week program to basically convince us that sex was the worst thing in the world until we got married, and that it was like the best thing in the world and have lots of babies. But it basically worked out to a lot of lessons on Sundays about the biblical teachings about husbands and wives and how women must be chaste and not have sex until marriage. And the basis of a lot of this was that Mary was around my age at the time, 15 or 16, when God decided to use her to carry the Christ child. And so therefore, women, as young women, we needed to be sexually pure so that we could be servants to God. At the time even, and I was totally taught not to question, because questioning your faith is a sign of lacking faith. But I was wondering at the time, is God going to bring another Christ child, and is it going to be me? And isn't that weird? Isn't that not what we're about? But that was the basis of it. And at the end of the 10-week program, we were all asked to go up on stage and pledge to remain virgins until we got married. When I say all, I mean mostly the girls. The guys took part in the classes, but they weren't required to go up on the stage at the end. The girls weren't either, but it's a pretty big incentive when you know that if you don't do it, you're going to be called a slut, or people will wonder why you didn't take the pledge, and your parents will ask all these questions about the person you've been hanging out with. So I did that when I was 15 and was totally fine with it, because I know this may sound really naive, but I had no idea what sex was. I didn't know it involved putting things in body orifices, or where the penis, fit in heterosexual sex, and how else, gay sex was completely unimaginable. All I knew is that it looked kind of awesome on TV, except that I just thought it meant you climbed under the covers and there was a lot of yelling and screaming, and then you had a cigarette. And since my mom smoked and my granddad smoked, I thought at some point you took up smoking as a part of sex. No, TV. Um, so I really didn't know much about it, but I did know and was told very seriously that having sex before marriage would send you to hell, and it was not something that you did. So I wasn't even very curious about it. And then I went to high school, which in itself wasn't a big deal, except that I had been very sheltered in my church community and really only had friends from church, and then I was suddenly in high school with lots of other people. And I was in math class, which I hated. I shouldn't say that as a women's rights organizer. Not all women are bad at math, but I am. And I was in this math class I hated, and I had a friend that I made in this class. And we went away for Christmas break, and then when we came back, she didn't come back for the first week. And then when she finally came back, she looked like absolute hell. Just no makeup, not dressed. She looked like she'd been crying, her eyes were swollen. And I asked her, what had happened and why she wasn't back for the first week. And she told me to shut up and that I didn't want to know and that I would judge her. And so I finally got her to tell me after she yelled at me a little bit. And she said she had found out she was pregnant and her parents had kicked her out of the house. And of course she'd come back to school, been told she was going to be kicked off the soccer team and was going to be sent to a special school. And so me being a very judgmental 16-year-old, raised in the background I said, well, how did you let that happen? Horrible, horrible. But she said, he told me I couldn't get pregnant the first time. And I looked at her, and I was like, oh, that's not true? She was like, obviously not, I'm pregnant, because she had only had sex with him once and not used contraception. And we talked a little bit more, but it was the turning point, I guess, in my whole life in which I realized that in one moment, someone had lied to her, and she trusted this person, and she didn't have the information to make a good decision for her body and to prevent a pregnancy, even though that's what she would have wanted. And I realized that someone could have said the same thing to me, and I would have probably made the same decision she did. And so that was my sort of first awareness that the world wasn't all roses and puppies and sunshine. I was raised like I was going to go to college and be a straight A student and everything. So of course, resume builders, a lot of you are probably really close to when you first came to college. So you join like all these organizations to put on your resume. So I joined something called the Lubbock Youth Commission, which was basically designed by the city to get youth voice into things. It was basically to placate a bunch of skateboarders that they had been kicking off the front of City Hall who were grinding on the steps. But so they made this youth commission, and they told us to take up a social issue. Now, later we found out they were thinking like littering, or loitering maybe, teen smoking or teen drinking at the most outrageous. But I had this friend, and I realized as she was being sent away, so Lubbock had such a high rate of teen pregnancies that we had an entire functional special school for pregnant young women called, I kid you not, New Directions. And this just seemed so wrong on so many levels, and I was watching what was happening to her, and so I started lobbying the other kids that we needed better sex education. We needed to make sure that no other young woman would ever be told she couldn't get pregnant the first time she had sex with a guy and believe him and have this happen. So I convinced us that we should take up sex education as an issue. And I did not think this would be hard. This just doesn't seem hard. We're kids, we know what we need, this happened, you have like huge amounts of pregnant girls. Why? Okay. And so we decided to look in the kind of sex ed that we had at that moment. And sex ed meaning sex education, but also the pastor who was brought into our secular school to teach his love, sex, and dating seminar. His name was Ed, so we called him Sex Ed. And he was local, he was like a cross between Bill Clinton and Guy Fieri. Like he had the tips, and he had this southern draw and big buck teeth, and he was the one who was always like hanging out with the drunk teenagers in the parking lot and like telling them to come to Sunday school. Only years later did I realize how creepy that was. But anyway, he was the guy who came into the schools. And he would say things like, you can get an STI, a sexually transmitted infection, by shaking hands with someone. Not true. He told us that half of all gay people die before the age of 40. Not true. I've had people come up after hearing that in the film about me and say, I'm 60 and I'm gay, so I guess I beat the stereotype. But the worst thing, the best thing, because it was just so absurd that he did, is he would always pull a young girl up on the stage, always a girl, and he would pull out this nasty toothbrush that looked like it had been used to scrub toilets. And he would say, well, would you brush your teeth with this? And she'd, ew, no. So he'd pull out a toothbrush, new in its box, and say, well, would you brush your teeth with this? So I'd say, I guess so. Then he'd turn around and hold up the dirty toothbrush. If you have sex before marriage, you're the dirty toothbrush. How many of you had something like that in your sex education classes? Yeah, quite a few of you. Did it involve tape or saliva or an Oreo? There's a lot of different ways to do this. There's tape, where you put tape on someone's arm and then you pass the piece of tape around the room, and then supposedly you're the dirty piece of tape that won't stick if you have sex before marriage. There's also the rose, where you pass around a rose and each person takes off a petal, and then if you have sex before marriage, then you're presenting your spouse with a thorny stem. Yes, this is what happened. I didn't know this at the time, of course. I thought this pastor was like the worst thing in the entire world, and he was teaching us this, and obviously we have to get rid of this. So we went to the school board, and we were like, okay, very respectfully, we don't think Ed is teaching us very much. Can we have some real sex education? Can we talk about condoms? Can we talk about queer people? And they pretty much laughed us out of the office. They were like, really? You don't know what you're talking about. Pat on the head. Go away. So that was sort of when I started to look on the internet, thank God for the internet, and realized that these kinds of programs not only were not particular to Lubbock, that they had a name called abstinence only until marriage programs, and that they were the only type of sex education, and I put it in scare quotes because it's not sex education, that the United States federal government had ever funded ever. To the tune of over $1 billion since 1981. And when that statistic was taken, when I started using it, it was 2003. So found out that this was a very systemic thing going on across the country. The history is kind of boring, but basically they started under Reagan. As sort of teen pregnancy prevention programs, blossomed under Clinton. So if you care about politics or not, the interesting thing was this was slipped into a good piece of legislation to make these big pools of abstinence-only funding, which states like Texas and Tennessee took its fair share of abstinence-only money to teach these things. So there were standards that they had to teach. If you're teaching sex education and you're getting this money, you have to teach that a mutually faithful monogamous relationship in the context of marriage is the expected standard of human sexual activity for all people. Now, notice how that leaves out huge, gigantic segments of the population. Queer people, people who choose not to get married, and it also ignores the fact that most people in our generation don't get married until we're almost 30. It had to teach that sexual activity outside the context of marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects. Example, Ed liked to tell us that if we masturbated too much, which is considered in his world sex outside of marriage, that we would become a selfish lover and that our partner might kill themselves one day and they might even murder our children. That bearing children out of wedlock is likely to have harmful consequences for the child's parent, and the entire society as a whole. So those were some of the things that you had to teach. There was also a mandate that if you talked about condoms, you had to talk about them in terms of their failure rates. So you couldn't talk about the massive amount of times, it's like 98% of times that condoms work. You have to talk about when they fail. So as you're probably figuring from my tone, these programs didn't work out so well. These, especially the ones that included the virginity pledges, like the one that I took. Within a year of taking a virginity pledge, it's been found that 38% of teens somehow forgot they ever took the pledge. They just don't report that they took it. And upwards of 40% break the pledge. So I guess we can take guesses now as to if I ever broke mine, or I'm not married yet, so in case you're wondering throughout the speech. So we decided this was something that we wanted to take on. And so we started a campaign in the community to get comprehensive sex ed into the schools. I could go into all the activist-y details, which is like awesome for me, but y'all probably don't want to know. But we did things like took parent surveys and got petitions signed amongst students. We testified at public hearings. I got certified to teach sex education through the Red Cross and started holding impromptu sex ed lessons in the bathroom and hiding condoms in my locker because you were not allowed to have prophylactics, is what they called them in the school code, on campus in your locker. So I started handing them out surreptitiously to people and accompanying people to Planned Parenthood to get tested for sexually transmitted infections and to have their reproductive health care and their needs taken care of. So we did this for 3 years. We fought this battle for 3 years. And a lot of things happened. I did get kicked out of my church. Not exactly kicked out. I was just first told that I was no longer a good role model to be singing in front of the church. I sang in front of the church every Sunday, and so then I was told I was not a good role model. Then I was told I couldn't teach children's choir anymore because they wouldn't want to expose the kids to me. And then I was told maybe I wasn't, adequate to be in the youth group anymore. Southern Baptists don't excommunicate. That was pretty much just telling me to leave. Let's see, I got into the Washington Post talking about sex education and gave the worst quote of my entire life to this day. I said, "There's nothing to do in Lubbock but have sex," said 15-year-old virginity pledger Shelby Knox. It's the most awkward phone call ever with my grandma after that. Let's see, I had an MTV True Life made about me. Also awkward. Especially because it was me and then this football player from some small southern town who had pledged virginity, and it was homecoming king and everything, and the pictures, the thing they have of me is trying to figure out this battle of the bands, to benefit reproductive health organizations, and it's raining and I'm trying to put together electronic equipment. It was not a fair portrayal. Anyway, so this was 3 years of activism in Lubbock, Texas. And at the end of this, right as I was about to graduate, we finally got to speak at a school board hearing. And I got 3 minutes to present 3 years of work and to ask for specific things. We asked simply that the information presented in sex education courses be medically accurate, because strangely enough, that's not a requirement. You can't teach 2 + 2 = 5, but you can tell kids that you can get an STI by shaking hands with someone, and that is that way to this day. There is not a federal mandate that sex education be correct, and there are very few state mandates that it be correct. And then we asked if the health department could bring in people to talk about sex in place of either the pastor or the PE teachers who couldn't say the word penis without giggling. And so I said that and at the school board meeting, and they said, "Thank you very much. We think that this falls exactly in line with Lubbock on all the other levels. We have the highest rates of drunk driving deaths in the state. We have the highest rates of stuff getting stolen out of cars because people don't lock their cars." They were basically just saying, so the city's stupid, so we don't have to do anything about this. And then they voted to petition the city council to shut down the Lubbock Youth Commission because we were obviously the problem. So that's not a really inspiring story about activism, is it? No, okay. I promise it gets better. I probably would have gone away and gone to UT, and when I say UT, I mean the University of Texas. I do not mean whatever the other one that y'all hate so much. Knoxville, UT Knoxville. Our color is just as ugly, burnt orange. But I would have gone to college and never probably done anything again, except that I had a documentary film made on me. These film producers from New York saw that horrible quote in the Washington Post, and were like, whoa, there's a story there. And so they came to Lubbock, and they started following and filming every step of my activism. So this basically meant for 3 years I was like on a reality show, before reality shows were cool, except it wasn't airing. I just had cameras following me all the time. And it was a very strange experience. You can ask me about that in the Q&A, but half the school did think I was like making some sort of sex tape. It's really strange. But anyway, this film was made, and it premiered at Sundance in 2005. And it chronicled my fight for sex education. And then the part that I left out, because it's sort of complicated, is that we also joined with a group of young people who were trying to get a gay-straight alliance started in Lubbock. Now, how do you think that went over in Lubbock, Texas? The principal of the school said that if they started a gay-straight alliance, they would also have to start a bestiality club and a Nazi club. Because they're exactly the same, obviously. So we also joined with them. So this film chronicled my activism for both sex education and this gay-straight alliance in Lubbock, Texas. And I was 17 at the time when the film came out, and in my first year of college. And that sort of began my evolution into public activist, although I probably, until that term was put on me, I would have never used it for myself, because I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, and good Southern girls don't use terms like activist. When I guess I was still under the impression that young people especially are to be seen and not heard. Were y'all ever told that? Yeah. And so I really was scared at first to be called an activist, because I was thinking, oh my God, I'm shaming my community, I've done something wrong. And I have to admit that even when I started to work on sex education in Lubbock, I couldn't figure out why no one else was doing it, because I really figured I was the last person in the world that should be doing it. First of all, the school district should have wanted us to have this information, in my mind. They should have been teaching us the correct information to begin with. I think our parents should have been pissed as hell when we had that high of teen pregnancy rates and that high of STI rates, but no one was saying anything. They were pushing it all into the rug. The federal government shouldn't have been giving money to schools to lie to us in the first place, but no one was talking about any of this. No one was saying anything. And my friend, who had gotten pregnant because of this misinformation, had a baby at home and had been shunted off to this school and couldn't use her voice to tell that story. And that was why I did what I did. Not because I wanted to have a movie made about me, not because I thought I was an activist, not because anyone in my family had ever done anything activist ever, or used that word in any good light at all. So the film, which is called The Education of Shelby Knox, which is another whole weird story, they told me the title, right before Sundance. I was like, what is it called? And they were like, The Education of Shelby Knox. And I was like, no, really, that's the dumbest title ever. What's the title? But it premiered at Sundance, and have any of you ever seen the Chris Matthews show? He's like can I use the word blowhard in Tennessee? He pontificates. He's this white guy on MSNBC. He has a show called Hardball. Anyway, I was on his show to talk about sex education, and he asked me if I was a feminist. Now, the only times I've really heard the word feminist up to this point are that my dad, unfortunately, listens to Rush Limbaugh and likes to call people feminazis. Rush Limbaugh does. My dad said it sometimes about me. And I had never really thought of calling myself a feminist. But somehow, at 17, I was sort of on this show, and I realized, okay, what's the real definition of feminism? Social, political, economic, cultural equality of men and women. Yes, I'm a feminist. And I said it on national television. And after that, I started to be asked to come and speak to groups like this one, at colleges all across the country, at Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood took me on a national speaking tour when I had just turned 18. And so I started to go to all these places. And I'm 25 now, But when I started this, I was the same age as some of you in here who are freshmen, and I was in my freshman year at the University of Texas. And it really scared the crap out of me. I didn't think that I knew anything more than anyone else in the room, and I didn't. But I had been given this privileged position to get to be up here instead of down in the audience. And the only thing I knew how to do was tell my story of what I had done, because I didn't have any, deep wisdom. I mean, I think 18-year-olds can have deep wisdom. I was not one of them. So I would just tell my story and usually tell it too fast. And I was being paid to do this. I was getting money to talk, and I was freaking out. And so I'd tell the story, and then I'd go, okay, so how about, has anyone else been an activist? Can someone else tell me what you've done? Have you ever felt this way? And my voice would get progressively higher. And someone finally, usually someone older than me, in the crowd would save me and stand up and say, when I was in high school, we had to petition the school to allow us to wear pants under our graduation uniforms, because girls were only allowed to wear skirts. Or someone would stand up and say, we fought for a gay-straight alliance at my school too, and this is how we won it, and they would share their experience. Some people's disclosures were incredibly personal and incredibly brave. I remember the first time I realized an impact of abstinence only until marriage education I'd never thought about before, which is when a young woman said that she had been sitting in her class hearing all about how people who weren't virgins were dirty and they were whores, and she kept thinking, because I was raped, do I get an exemption, or am I still a dirty whore? And she told that to an entire auditorium full of people, and it was the first time, in my experience, I'd ever even thought about it that way at 18 years old. And so I started to realize that whenever I would do this and ask for these other stories, that someone else would stand up and say, something similar happened to me. Or I felt that way too. I thought it was just me. I thought that I was just crazy. And this happened in so many places that I realized it wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't just people covering for me because I wasn't talented enough to fill my speaking time. I had not yet figured out what feminism was until one day I was doing this. And a girl stood up and started sharing her experience of feeling like at school, how sometimes you talk in a class and the professor's like, okay, and then a guy says the exact same thing. He's like, yes, that's great. Let's capitalize on that point. Let's do that. And that had happened to me a lot at school. And suddenly I realized, hey, that's sexism. That sucks. And that happens to me in Texas the same way that it's happening to her in Florida. That's bigger than both of us. And that was when I realized what feminism was to me. Feminism is hearing your pain and your struggle and your experience in another person's voice, and suddenly realizing there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with them, but there's something in the world that's trying to make that you think that there is. And that was the first time I started calling myself a feminist activist, which was a huge deal to my family, to my poor Southern grandmother, to my mom. I was in the Stanford paper described as radical young feminist. My mom called me. She's a Google alert on me. So when I say feminist in a place like this, how many of you identify as feminist? Wow. Okay, that's pretty awesome. And there's no judgment in that whether or not. There are plenty of reasons not to identify as feminist, which I can tell you in a second. But I always like to clarify, feminism is not about man-hating. I don't hate men. I love men. In fact, I think that feminism is about allowing male and female and people who do not define on the gender binary to have their entire humanity. So each of us are given, as men and women, or put into those roles and given half of a personhood, half the experiences, half the emotions, half the expectations of the world. And only when we have gender equality, and only when we eliminate this binary of what men and women should be like, can we all, male, female, and people who don't identify, be fully human. So feminism is so far from man-hating. Men would be allowed so much more of their humanity if we lived in a feminist world. Feminism is not just for lesbians. Of course, there are a lot of lesbians who identify as feminists, a lot of straight women, a lot of trans women, a lot of queer people, but this stereotype that you have to be a lesbian to be a feminist, or to be a feminist you have to be a lesbian, is not true. In fact, all of my close radical feminist friends in New York are all living with their male partners. There's no bitterness there or anything. So feminism, obviously, as I said, is not just for women. There are many, many male feminists, including Jake Gyllenhaal. He identifies as a male feminist. Yeah, he's kind of like a feminist. I don't know. He's an internet sensation amongst young feminists. Also, in terms of men, so Ms. Magazine, have anyone ever heard of Ms. Magazine? Yay! It was the first sort of feminist magazine that went national. It was started in 1972. It's going to be the 40th anniversary next year by Gloria Steinem and a cohort of other fantastic women. But they did a survey sometime in the 80s about the causes of death between men and women. And they found that if you took out all of the causes of death that can be attributed to the masculine role, so like motorcycle accidents and things that have to do with, men doing stupid things, trying to race each other or daredevil each other out of something, or heart attacks from the stress of jobs and things like that, that men would live 7 years longer. So if nothing else, feminism can give you 7 more years of life. Feminism is not just by and for white women, although the feminist movement has a history, like many other social justice movements in this country and others, of racist, classist, homophobic, transphobic oppression. And when I said earlier that there are valid reasons, of course, not to identify as feminist, of course it's just maybe you don't believe it or you don't care about it or you don't want to use that word, which is perfectly valid. But there is, amongst groups of women of color, another word called womanist, which Alice Walker wrote about in her book, specifically to identify as the woman of color experience of gender justice. The word gender justice is another word that you can use other than feminism, which basically takes away the F word and the history that may not be safe or useful for all people. Reproductive justice is another word that you can use besides pro-choice that encompasses all of the different reproductive options that people can have, having children, how you have them, not having children, not parenting them, and that is a woman of color pioneered term. So it's not, I know feminism has a picture that you imagine. It's usually of someone like Gloria Steinem or like me or like Jessica Valenti, but the history is very rich and very nuanced. And feminism, finally, is not unnecessary. Women still make 77 cents to the dollar. For black women, it's 65 cents. For Latino women, it's 55 cents. Women hold 90, or almost 17% of the 535 seats in the 112th US Congress. You all know this, but I'm just going to remind you, we are 51% of the population, those who identify as female. Let's see, in all of history, Tennessee has had 6 female members of Congress. Did y'all know that? 3 of them served after their husbands died, and they were elected to those seats. And Tennessee has never, ever, in all of the history of having elected representatives, had a female senator or a female governor. So it's not as if we live in a completely gender-neutral society and all of the gains have been won for women. So that's sort of my speech on what feminism is not. And then the title of this speech is sort of strange to me. I guess this went off. How a good Southern girl changed the world. Because it's been so long since I thought of myself as a good Southern girl. But we all know, how many of you are from the South? Yeah, quite a few of you. So those of us who are, we know what that term means. We know what good Southern girl means, even though no one's ever written that book or told us the rules of what that actually is. So for instance, I went and had my nails done yesterday because we don't stand for chip nail polish. Or at least my mom would kill me if I showed up in the South with chip nails. I had fake nails from when I was 10 to when I was 18. like fake acrylic nails because my mom made me. You have to have a nice bag starting at age like 10 or 11. I don't know if this generation is different, but for mine it was Dooney Burke. I had a Dooney Burke at 11. We know what a good Southern girl is. And we also have this thing called Southern charm, which is basically, a way to smile at someone you hate and say, oh, it's so good to see you today. And no one ever knows it. People in New York always comment on that. They're like, you're so nice and cheerful all the time, and you're so kind to everyone. And I'm like, oh, thank you. But I used to believe that good Southern girls didn't become feminists, and they didn't become activists. And that's, what I was told. And then I realized that we actually are feminists and we are activists, but we probably don't use those words, some of the things that we do. You know how you always pull together your friends after something really crappy happens, someone breaks up with you, or you have a really hard time on a test, and you all make cocktails, you make margaritas and get everybody drunk and start talking about how your ex-boyfriend cheated on you too, and he was such an asshole, and he keyed your car, and like this is what happened. And you share your experiences until you make your sister, your friend, feel better. Okay, that's something we do well as Southern girls. That's consciousness-raising groups. That's our shared experiences so that we know we're not alone and so we're not crazy. That's sisterhood. We do that really, really well. The way that, especially raised in faith communities, the way that we do community service, the way that we do projects, and feel like that's a core human value. And I know the sororities, I'm sure y'all do. I don't know if you have to do community service, but I know that you do. It's something that's instilled in good Southern girls from like the time that we're born. And that in itself is activism. When you go and walk for the breast cancer walk, which I think was recently, when you raise money for domestic violence, when you co-sponsor events on campus about body awareness or racism or whatever it is that you're doing, that's activism, even though you may not be calling it that. The way that Southern moms fight like angry bears for their children, have you ever noticed this? Like my mom is the nicest person in the world and has that like really fake Southern charm, but dang, she used to go to town with my teachers in this like fierce protective way. And I never thought I would be like that until I got to New York and realized that somehow I'm like more protective of everyone else than like some of my northern friends. We take care of each other. It's loyalty, and that again is sisterhood, something that we have. And then also, and this may just be Texas or maybe just me, but I do feel like in the South, we have a real sincere respect for our elders, and especially our female elders. My grandma is the matriarch of our family. Her word is law. You don't do anything in her house she doesn't want you to do. She finds your flask, you're dead. All these different things. But in that way, we know our history. When I was younger, I had to learn to bake biscuits with Mimi. I am the least domestic person in the entire world. There's no way I'm ever making these biscuits. I didn't realize until years later that what she was actually doing by forcing me to sit through these biscuit making lessons was telling me her history, that she got married at 15, that she had a kid overseas in France at 16, how she survived it, how she survived her husband dying when she was 30, and raising 3 kids and getting married and all of these things, and really learning from that history. And that's something that I think that we do incredibly well, is listen to our female elders. Also, just a tip, this is not related to feminism. Older women in the North do not appreciate ma'am. Just FYI. Some of y'all think this is funny. No. They think it's like they think you're calling them old. So you say yes, ma'am, to like one of the like icons of the feminist movement, and they're like, "Don't call me ma'am. I'm not that old." Anyway, so that's pretty much my spiel. But I had another speech earlier that I gave in Lubbock, and it was interesting because I ended it with the line that there are a lot of benefits to being known as a good Southern girl in the South. You're not ostracized. You get pretty things for Christmas. You can avoid those questions about when are you going to be a mommy or things like that if your nails look nice enough. But the fun, the risk, and how you will change the world is going a little bit outside of that mold and finding out that you don't break and that you can't be a good Southern girl forever. So, okay. Yeah. Does anyone have questions? Oh, I think Alice.
Do you still consider yourself Southern Baptist?
I don't consider myself Southern Baptist because I don't think they would want me to consider myself Southern Baptist. I mean, I still consider myself a spiritual person, but it's actually really difficult to be raised in a community that you're told is welcoming and loving and will always support you and this is your family, and then they completely disavow you and sort of throw you away. So I had a hard time with organized religion for a while and still do. And also about the virginity pledge. Like at some point I realized, wow, I made that pledge to my male father, a male God, my male pastor, and my presumed future male spouse. Where was I? Anywhere in there? I wasn't anywhere in there. And I started to look at the religion and see how male-dominated it was. And so I'm still sort of struggling through those questions of faith. But no, I don't think the Southern Baptist Church wants me. Sure. So my parents were always supportive of the sex education. They couldn't believe that wasn't being taught. They were a little less supportive of gay rights. They came around during the Prop 8 debate to supporting gay marriage. Also, my mom started volunteering at Planned Parenthood. And so the president of Planned Parenthood in Lubbock and his life partner are the most awesomely fabulous gay men ever. And she really went to a dinner party at their house and was like, I just can't imagine these people being told that they don't have a valid relationship and can't get married. Totally came around. My dad has gotten in trouble at work for putting too many pictures and posters of me in his office from the magazines I've been in and things like that. So very supportive. And then I think the thing that I will try not to cry while saying it, but my brother is trying out to be a Texas cowboy. I don't know if you've ever seen a University of Texas game, but the ones that handle that big cow, Bevo, our big longhorn, they drug him during the games, but he sits on the sidelines, and anyway, the Cowboys are the ones that handle him, and he was asked in the process if he could be a woman in history, who would he be? And he said, I would be my sister. Which is funny. Which is funny and makes me sad because a couple years ago he was working for the McCain campaign, and he and I were fighting all the time. And so he's definitely come around, and now he's like Sarah Palin is the most terrifying vice presidential candidate. But yeah, so that's my family now. Other questions?
I was just curious how you feel
Where are
about
you?
the fact that President Obama supports No Child Left Behind, since it has so much in its legislation about abstinence-only sex education, and like he's so progressive in so many other ways, yet he still supports this legislation that is, like, in my shared view, backwards.
Right. So first of all, while I'm generally Democrat, certainly don't support everything that Obama does, I will say that this is the first administration to ever actively fund comprehensive sex education. So there is now a pool of money that goes to comprehensive sex ed. But yeah, it's messed up. It's a policy we advocate against. Lots of feminists, think that he's wrong on that. So yeah, there's that. I will say that for the first time ever, states get to apply for comprehensive sex ed money. So if you have friends or siblings or cousins or whatever who are in high school, ask them what kind of sex education they're getting, because for the first time ever, it's now possible for their school to apply for funding to teach comprehensive sex education. And they can do something very similar to what I did, except that now the funding is there. And you can talk, I'm sure, to Katie, and there's some individuals here from Planned Parenthood later if you have questions about how to do that specifically in Tennessee and surrounding states.
How do you reconcile your Southern upbringing with your beliefs? Is it difficult to be able to say, I was raised this way and I love my family and the community I grew up in, but I don't agree with what they think. How do you like deal with that two-parted kind of part of yourself?
You know, for some reason, I mean, I was very, very, very lucky that I have parents who are accepting and loving and did not kick me out of my house or did not disavow me. But another Southern value is that, in general, shouldn't, blood be thicker than water? Shouldn't love overpower politics? At the end, isn't me being your daughter more important than how I vote or who I date? To me, that's just basic common sense than it was to my family. Sometimes it's hard, strangely enough, the other way around. Northern prejudice is real. Northerners do think that those of us down here are kind of stupid sometimes, or it's backwards. And so to not have to actually disavow my culture in some Northern situations, but to explain that it's nuanced and that there are different communities, all across the South, and people aren't monolithic, is very specific. And I try very hard not to, I make fun of Lubbock because Lubbock is interesting, but to fall into that red state, blue state divide, because we have so much more in common than we do apart.
Something that my friends and I have noticed lately is that, and we're all totally for women's sexual liberation, etc. But something that we've noticed lately is that maybe the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction, because in a lot of universities and friends who don't go here, and it's not just here, there's this hookup culture. Mm-hmm. And while that's all fine and good and it's fun to go out and hook up, it's really hard for us to get respect or even asked on a date anymore. And I was wondering what you thought about sort of the backswing and maybe it going too far in the direction of sexual liberation in that now there's just no rules about dating. Because I would like a guy to be interested in more than just sex.
Right. So I think it's really easy to confuse sexual liberation with liberation in general. Or why is having sex like men privileged? Why is that better? It's also a very messed up way for it to even say that, because not all men want sex all the time, and some women want a lot of sex. It shouldn't be gendered like that. But I don't think I don't think that comes from women's liberation or sexual liberation. One thing I think it comes up in our culture, or our generation, is a lot of this abstinence-only stuff. The repression around sex, the fact that we're not taught to talk about relationships, and that sex is something to be sort of hidden and forgotten about. One of the most interesting things a teenager ever told me was how convenient the term hookup was. I was like, what do you mean? She was like, well, girls are all hoping when you say I hooked up with him that people think it means I made out with him. Guys are all hoping when I say I hooked up with her, it means I had sex with her. And so I think that we have to examine the innate sexism in the double standard, that when women do this, that they're called sluts and they're called whores. We have to examine our presumption about guys, straight guys in heterosexual relationships, and that sex is all they want. Perhaps go back to what men are taught in abstinence only, which I didn't talk about a lot, but men are actually taught that they're like these hormonal raging sex machines, and that is the standard of masculinity. And what if they're not? What if that's sort of a standard that they think they're supposed to meet, but they want relationships as well? So I think we have to recognize the dynamics in all of those things. And also, this sounds ridiculous because this is basic sex ed, but when you look at studies and when you actually sit down and talk to people, perceived peer behavior, like what you think other people are doing, is actually usually far elevated than what other people are actually doing. So I've always been really skeptical that this is the hookup generation and that this is hugely pervasive. Of course I know it happens. I did it. It happened at college. But I don't think that this is something that's so serious that it defines our generation. Other questions?
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Firstly, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your speech.
Thank you.
I was just wondering what you're currently doing to further your personal activism, and what you would suggest for someone who's trying to represent a very small subculture of another community to try to get their voice out there more in order to, become more equal as a whole.
Okay, cool. So for a long time I didn't have a job. I just traveled across the country and did things like this and helped young people organize on college campuses. I'm now the director of women's rights organizing for change.org. Have you ever heard of change.org? It's a petition platform in which anyone, anywhere can start a petition on anything that they care about. And my job is for free to help people organize behind those sort of things. So we helped pull down that horribly sexist JCPenney t-shirt. Do you remember that? It said, "I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me." Gag me. And to more serious things, like tomorrow the FBI is holding a hearing on the definition of rape because it's 80 years old, and it only includes penis-vagina penetration. It doesn't include penetration with objects, anal penetration. It assumes that men and trans folks can't be raped. So that's very big deal, and it happened after we got 150,000 signatures and Ms. Magazine pushed it. So that's what I'm doing now, and I would encourage any of you who have an issue that you would like to organize on to start a petition on change.org. It's really easy. It is not the only form of activism. You need to do other things around it. But for instance, we've had a lot of college campuses start petitions. Students on college campuses start petitions to get clarification in their sexual harassment policies, or to get gender-neutral bathrooms, or gender-neutral housing, those sorts of things that work on college campuses. How to get involved and represent sort of small communities. I think our generation is blessed with the internet. It has made spaces safer for people to be honest about their experiences, to be their true selves. It has taken down some of the barriers of access. It used to be you could only have certain conversations in a classroom or at an activist meeting, and now you can have them online. Tumblr, I don't know if you're on Tumblr. If you're not on Tumblr, it is the most hip, radical space for young activists, younger than us, a lot of high school students, but it's really a place for radical politics. Twitter. Tweet about the things that you care about. Tweet at the people who you admire in that community, and often they will start a discussion with you. For some reason, Twitter is a way to take down the barriers. I randomly started talking to Congresswoman Maloney, who's my congresswoman, and I was like, "It's not really you, is it?" And she's like, "Of course it's me. I'm typing on my iPhone in the car on the way to a speech." And I was like, "Oh, wow." So Twitter is a great way. Making our own media is very important. So for me, the reason that I got to do what I do and how I do it now is telling my own story. And oftentimes, communities that are marginalized and erased are not represented in history and are not represented within the mainstream narrative. And so that makes it harder to make gains for equal rights. And so we have to bring those stories and those experiences into the mainstream consciousness however we can. So get a flip cam and interview people, start an anonymous blog, start posting pictures of, one of my favorite things on Tumblr is a Tumblr called Fuck Yeah Fat Girls. And it is very body positive of big, fat women who are sexy and proud of it. So sort of do something to subvert the narrative and to make communities visible.
Hello.
Hi.
I totally appreciate what you said earlier about women being massively underrepresented in politics, but I would like you to know that Tennessee was the final state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and I'm very proud of that. All of you should be grateful to Tennessee for your right to vote. And
it's a very cool story, too.
Oh, it is. It's awesome. One man changed the vote. Anyway, I get excited about suffragism. Anyway, but I had a question for you, which was, there's a large number of women in here, and I think you've reached a lot of people tonight, but part of the challenge is also getting men to understand feminism and activism and why we should even care. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions on getting men more involved. I know you mentioned looking at what they've learned and try to deconstruct those gender roles. But if you had any ideas on how to get more people to events like this.
So I think media is a really good opportunity. Watching TV and watching movie with guy friends is a perfect sort of place to talk about feminism. And you don't have to call it feminism. But there was a commercial for an alcohol. I can't even remember which one, but it was like a cougar prowling through the field, and then it was this guy like moving his way to ask this woman to dance, and it was basically like he was stalking his prey, and the whole thing was like very, very creepy. And I was watching it with a couple of my brother's friends, and I was like, what do y'all think about that? And they're like, yeah, he's gonna get her, he's gonna go dance with her and stuff. And I was like, really? Like, how do you think if she in her head like saw you as the cougar coming to eat her? Like, how would that make her feel? It's like, well, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't want a woman to think I was going to eat her, unless it was in the good way. And it's like, yeah, I mean, we don't like to be preyed upon. Do you like to be thought of as predators? Well, no, predators are bad. And so it was a commercial, and it was a very short conversation with these young men who thought about it differently. We're like, I don't want to be portrayed as a predator. There's a new Dr. Pepper commercial that says it's not for women. It's like Dr. Pepper 10. It's not for women. It has 10 calories, so men are supposed to drink it, as opposed to the diet soda. And I was talking to my brother again about this, and he was like, wait. I think that's sexist against us. And I was like, it is. It thinks you're that shallow that you will buy a product just because it says it's for men only and not for women. So I think media is a great way to start those conversations. Also, this is harder to do for just random people, but the pressures of masculinity, to really have conversations with male friends about what it's like to be pressured by friends to have sex with lots of girls, or what it's like to be with friends who make gay jokes, and you have to prove you're not gay by being mean to gay people, or things like that. The sports culture that not all guys want to do sports or watch sports, but there's sort of that thing. So talking about the expectations, just as we talk so much about women, and then there's so many wonderful projects that male feminists do that I think some guys would think is really cool. Like, have you ever heard of Walk a Mile in Her Shoes? The anti-sexual assault and sexual violence. It's like where guys raise money and they walk a mile in high heels and raise money for women. The Good Men Project is another one. Men Can Stop Rape. I've known wonderful guys who actually agreed with everything that I believe, but felt like we would be offended. We as like feminists would be offended if a guy tried to come in to that space. So it's not at all, but some guys feel more comfortable in like all dude feminist spaces, and that's okay too.
I've identified as a feminist since I was like 12 or 13. But one of the biggest issues that I run into when I'm trying to discuss feminism with other men is the term itself. Even once I explain to them that feminism is about gender equality, I've still gotten objections saying that they disagree with the term because femme is obviously a gendered term. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I have an attachment to the word because of the history of it. Also, feminism has always benefited people who look like me and identify like me, most obviously. So I obviously have that attachment. But I don't care if you freaking identify as a rabbit, as long as you're working for gender equality. Feminism is humanism. If humanism works better, say that. Sometimes no word at all. Sometimes don't even put it in a political context. Would you like your sister to make the same amount of money as a guy with the same profession? Yes. I'm attached to the word from a women's history standpoint. I love women's history. But in terms of like a real making political change, screw it. Don't use the word. If that's a barrier, male, female, if that's hard for you or hard for your friends, don't say it. It doesn't matter that much. Okay. Thank y'all.